Stephen, just this one.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and hi to everybody online. I'm not Yudvinda. My name is Caitlin Hafferty. I'm a postdoc with a project called the Levy-Hume Centre for Nature Recovery, obviously, that sponsors this. Today, we are really delighted to welcome a panel of various different people who are sitting here, who will all introduce themselves shortly. And the idea is to talk about why we really need to embed understandings of the connections between people and nature at the heart of initiatives to tackle climate and biodiversity issues. And the idea from this came from an event that actually Michael and Beth were part of a couple of years ago in Natural England about the social science contributions to nature recovery. So we want to showcase why we really need social sciences at the absolute heart of this, and not just particular kinds of social sciences, but a diverse range of different types of knowledge, different ways of measuring and understanding data. So I'm going to pass over to Connie first, who co-leads the Society Work Package as part of the Levy-Hume Centre with Jamie. Connie, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, so welcome everyone. On behalf of the Leverhulme Center for Nature Recovery, as many of you may know, this is an interdisciplinary center that's based here at Oxford University and has partnerships with organizations across the UK and internationally. The vision, as stated up there, is that we're looking to better understand and support an inclusive nature recovery at scale. I can change the slide. They did not hire me for my technological expertise. So, okay, I'll just use one of the, okay, thanks, it's not moving. Okay. Excellent. So, yeah, so I and a number of members of this panel are social scientists, and we're involved in the society research theme of the Leverhulme Center. And naturally, as social scientists, we see nature recovery as fundamentally a social challenge. And the idea of inclusiveness is not just a normative goal, but it's actually instrumental to how we think about rethinking and recovering our relationships with the natural world. This is because not only is it important how we relate to each other if we're going to cooperate to achieve nature recovery, but also how we think about our relationships with ourselves in the natural world shapes our relationships with other species and the environment. So with this in mind, this is not how, thank you, Stephen. Okay. Okay, with this in mind, we have research projects happening in the Highlands of Scotland, in the farmlands of Oxfordshire, and also in southern Ghana. And here, one of the things that we're looking at are some new natural capital market projects that are really looking to capture finance in this way to finance nature recovery. And these projects really generate a lot of demand for very precise and scalable technologies to measure biodiversity and natural processes, and also to attach dollar values to them so that we can finance nature in this way. What we're interested in is how do these projects affect who has a voice in nature recovery? How do they shape who has access to the land and natural resources, who gains access through these projects? Whose visions of nature do they represent, and how do they share benefits? And through this knowledge, we can then inform how to design such projects to be more inclusive. And along those lines, we're very interested in how can some of these new technologies actually serve to empower the voices of local people and local knowledge. So I think Eric, for example, will be speaking some to this. But also on the same landscapes, we're also looking at other approaches to nature recovery. As we know, there are countless grassroots strategies to recover nature. Many of us might be involved in some. And there are also traditional practices that are already contributing to nature and without billions of dollars of external finance. So we're really interested in how can we make these projects also more visible and better support them? Because after all, we want to achieve a very inclusive and scalable nature recovery. why not include a greater diversity of voices, of worldviews, and of practices in order to achieve this? So along those lines, I think all the panelists will speak to some of these ideas, and I'd like to hand the floor to them to share their own views on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Connie. Just before I hand over to our first panelist, just out of interest, because we have no other way of testing this, but hands up if you are a social scientist. Okay, about half the room, maybe. And hands up if you're a natural scientist. Hands up if you're something else. Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Practitioners, community, amazing. Right, brilliant. That's great. Patrick, over to you. Thank you.
Stand up here.
Yes, and don't want to hold this too close to your mouth because it sounds a bit
Overwhelming.
Yeah.
Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to break into song or anything. So we're okay. So yeah, let me introduce myself. My name is Patrick Devine-Wright. I'm a professor in geography at the University of Exeter. And I've been there for about 10 or 15 years. And I'm probably here because one of the hats I wear is the director of an ESRC funded program called Access. And Access is about advancing the capacity and the impact and the visibility of the social sciences in addressing and solving environmental problems of all kinds, including climate change. So apparently I've got 6 minutes to contribute before we run into a discussion. So obviously that's not an awful lot of time. I'll just say a few things. And I guess just to clarify my positionality on this, all of my university training is in social science, but it's in the discipline of psychology. I did an undergraduate degree in psychology and then a master's in environmental psychology and then a PhD in social psychology. But I've spent the last 15 years in geography as a professor in a geography department. And geography is a really interesting discipline because to me, it's much more open than psychology was. Certainly feels like that. You can be a bit more risky. It seems to be so much more diverse in lots of ways. So it's kind of a natural home for a lot of people who might be more interdisciplinary oriented. And I suppose in a nutshell, what I would say is that what I've learned from my academic career is that we tend to get trained as disciplinarians, but very few disciplines have all the answers. You know, it's almost impossible to imagine that climate change or any of these other environmental problems will be solved by any one discipline. They give you partial takes on a problem, and they're very unlikely to give you all of the solutions. So we have to find ways of listening and collaborating and working together and bringing pluralities of knowledges together. And what's the best way to do that? So if we think about environmental problems, to me, it's almost self-evident that they are socially embedded, that we have to look to the social sciences to understand them and to address them and to solve them. But actually, that's not a self-evident position at all. Most of the time, we look to the natural sciences to understand environmental problems. And I had some experience with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, over the last 10 years. What's interesting is that they have 3 working groups: a modeling working group, understanding atmospheric change at the global level. And that was where the IPCC started. It started with that very science base, and they still have a discourse of climate science emanating from the institution as a whole. And then gradually they added working groups to do with adaptation or mitigation. And in the last assessment round, I was brought into a chapter which was the first time that any of these working groups had a social science specific dimension to it. So it took decades to get that innovation into place. So these structures change slowly. But what we do know is that it's the convention to look to science first of all, and to bring scientific expertise and knowledge to bear. And that's the case if you look across government as well. We have chief scientific advisors, most of whom come from STEM subjects. We don't have chief social scientists by and large. That doesn't tend to happen. So our understanding of knowledge and expertise is skewed, I think, not to in any way take away from the value of science, but the way we think about knowledge and expertise is skewed by that valuation of science per se as what we need in order to solve problems. And that makes it a bit more challenging to say, well, what about the social dimensions? And what do the social scientists actually bring to the table? And I think one of the things I would like to see really change is what we call the end of pipe syndrome, where the social scientists are brought in after the problem has been framed, the solutions have been identified, and then we need to bring some social scientists in to work out how to make people accept it or how to make communities adopt it. everything else has already been set up, and it's too late really at that stage. I'd really like to see social sciences brought in a bit earlier. There is increasing, I think, awareness and support for multiple forms of knowledge being brought into bear. And that's not just other kinds of expertise like social sciences, but also lay knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, local knowledges. All of those have a part to play. And for me, it's a critical social science question to understand how do you best bring those into play in a way that does justice to what they have to offer, rather than it being tokenistic or co-opted or still fundamentally being framed by science in some shape or form. So let me just finish by talking about the Access network that I just mentioned. It's Access's role to try and enable the social science contributions to be a bit more visible. And we do that in a whole variety of ways. We kind of aspire to a situation where in the future, large research consortia or environmental initiatives are led by social scientists, not just engineers or natural scientists. But to do that, we have to instill confidence and skills in early career researchers, which they don't necessarily have coming out of a PhD in geography or sociology or political science or whatever it might be. We have to enable them. So one of the things we do every year is we have a leadership college where we bring 20 up and coming people with a social science background. They're not all in universities. Some of them are working in the public sector or the charitable sector or the private sector. And we bring them together every year. So they're a kind of a growing network of people who we hope will go on to have the skills and the ambition to take environmental problems forward, not just following other people's knowledges, but being part of that leadership program for it. We run task forces to bring different social scientists together. The social sciences don't always talk to each other. In fact, when you've got a very small pool of resources, we're often fighting against each other most of the time, I think, for scarce funding awards. Sociologists don't always agree with how psychologists look at things, et cetera, et cetera. There are methodological debates and disputes. So what Access tries to do at least is to work on that rather fragmented picture a lot of the time and find ways to bring people together. And task forces are one way that we do that. So we recently finished a net zero task force where we had political scientists and geographers and sociologists working together to synthesize evidence and then take that to policy and say, look, actually, let's have a look at this. And what we noticed from net zero policy was that it was very supply side, technocentrically oriented. It was about small nuclear reactors. It was about carbon capture and storage, presented as things, as objects, as technical artifacts. And thinking about, say, reducing demand or thinking about social dimensions of just transition, for example, had far less emphasis upon net zero, say, research and innovation documents. So that's a very incomplete picture. And that needs to be addressed by bringing social scientists in a bit earlier, I think, as I mentioned, challenging that end pipe framing. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to say just one or two last things. I guess the other thing that Access tries to do is to be principled in the way we practice our social science. And we have three fundamental guiding principles. One is environmental sustainability. We don't feel we can have any credibility ourselves to be trusted experts if we don't look after and try and mitigate and reduce our own emissions. So we almost ban flying. We don't really, I mean, but we are very reluctant to travel in ways that will have impact. So we try and design our events to enable that to be minimized. That's absolutely crucial. Secondly, we think about co-production of knowledge. There are lots of these ideas floating around about bringing different forms of expertise together, co-design, co-production. They're all informative ways, and we try and bring that into our work. So when we engage with stakeholders, it's not seen as a kind of a one-way ticket. We're the experts. You're the people who need our information. It's a one-way flow. Instead, it's much more of a two-way listening exercise as much of a speaking exercise into government. And we meet government organizations every quarter in our policy and practice working group. And finally, we think about diversity and inclusion. And that's something that's really important in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, lots of other categories. How are we representing social science and how are we enabling social science knowledge to be truly representative? And that's not always something that the environmental social sciences are particularly strong in. So those are just some ideas, our task forces, our ways of doing work through guiding principles, our leadership college, our annual assembly, where we bring different social scientists together of all different career paths and policy in the same room. All of that needs to happen, I think, in order to fulfill the goals of this seminar, which is to bring these different forms of knowledge together, because we are at a very urgent time. We do need to act. We haven't got much time. And there's so much inertia in our systems and structures, including inside of academia, that's preventing rapid change. So let's get on with it. There you go.
Thank you. Beth Brockett.
Hi everyone, while Stephen gets the slides up, I'll introduce myself. I'm a senior social scientist in forest research. We're the leading research agency for forests, everything forests, trees, woodlands, across Great Britain, so England, Scotland, Wales. And possibly unsurprisingly, I'm going to echo Patrick's message that better integration of the social sciences is pretty much essential, and now, if we're going to tackle the really complex and urgent environmental crises that we're seeing. And so on the screen's one definition of environmental social sciences. It's been developed by the Access Project, and I'm a co-investigator on that. So my perspective is slightly different. I'm coming to you as a government scientist. I work directly with policymakers and all of the different roles that entails, including different scientists, research officers, but also practitioners. They often get forgotten. So people that enact policy. And I used to be one of those people who worked in operations. So as well as stating that we need better integration of the social sciences, my first of two provocations, and I was asked to provoke you, is that much more environmental research and related activities need to be cognizant of and explicitly linked with policy and practice, much more. So I've worked in government agencies for 8 years now, Natural England and Forest Research. As I said, in operations, I was a farm conservation advisor, and as a social scientist. I've got an ecology background. I then moved into social sciences. I suppose I call myself still a human geographer. I don't really know what I am anymore. But as with many of my social sciences colleagues, I have to do a little bit of everything. When I first joined the social science team in Natural England, there were 5 of us, and for a long time there have been less than 2. So we've had to do a little bit of everything, and it depends a little bit on what the trend is at the time, what the fashion is. I've done quite a lot of behavioural sciences recently, even though I've never done a training course in it in my life. So it's a bit of a recipe for imposter syndrome. And I developed this slide to surprise my colleagues with the range of disciplines and approaches that social sciences has, as Patrick mentioned. So I believe that with a few exceptions, there is very little truly interdisciplinary environmental research that occurs, that includes the natural sciences and the social sciences in a properly interdisciplinary way, especially if you require it to speak to policy and practice needs. There's a mismatch between what's needed and what's being delivered, to be honest. So we hear about making evidence policy relevant. For example, writing briefs for policymakers. Who are these mythical policymakers? Do you know any? Have you spoken to any? Have you got a clear picture of who might be reading your research? About how government scientists and analysts work those people in operational roles? What's their part in this evidence into policy process? Are they in government departments? Are they in government agencies? Maybe they're in Parliament. So how does evidence get used within policy and practice spaces? What expectations are there of the evidence? They're all really interesting and important questions, and I'm going to focus on asking, what do policymakers and practitioners need environmental evidence to consider? So I'm going to paint a picture of one of these roles, a colleague who's a government research officer, someone who gathers and translates evidence for their policy colleagues. The evidence they pass on largely needs to be interdisciplinary because the environment includes humans, policy is not developed in a vacuum, it builds on previous policy, it has financial and legal considerations, it has to work alongside other policies, it has to consider who might be affected intentionally and unintentionally, who has the resource and the know-how to deliver the policy, and how might the policy be perceived? Where will the policy be enacted and who will do that? So, how will it be evaluated? So my research officer colleague needs to provide evidence which considers all of that, which is ready to be used. They're very, very busy people. They don't read journal articles largely. I don't think they read journals. They commission research and they project manage it. They translate evidence. They collate evidence. They keep up with the latest policy developments. Can be really, really fast moving, as you can imagine. The number of secretaries of state we've had for the environment the last 6 years. There's a lot of policy movement. So we need to help these people. And they also need to provide insight across a range of disciplines and subject areas, most of which they won't have been trained in. So they rarely, as I said, if ever have time to read journal articles. We don't have great access in government anyway. If it's behind a paywall, it's a bit of a pain to get hold of. And they need evidence tailored for the specific policy or delivery question they have been given. So it may be that your latest mapping tool identifies the optimal areas for restoring a type of habitat. Oh, sorry, Colin. But unless you have considered who might use the tool, what's the relevant policy landscape? What knowledge and skills will they need? Why might they be motivated to use your tool? How might they integrate the findings from your tool alongside the findings from all the other tools that are available? They're not going to probably use it. And I'm not saying all research has to be interdisciplinary, and I'm not saying it all has to be policy and practice relevant, but a lot more of it does, because otherwise we're not going to solve these emergencies. I was going to finish with something a bit more positive. I've run out of time, so that's for the discussion. Thanks, everyone.
You bet. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I thought I'd kick you. Eric.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Caitlin. Yeah, let me introduce myself briefly whilst Stephen gets things set up. I'm Eric Mensah Kumeh. Background broadly, very interdisciplinary. I started off with agroforestry and went to practice a bit, and looking at how social issues were often neglected in a lot of decision making, then I stepped up and shifted a bit into environmental governance. Today, I don't really know what best characterizes me, but I often say I'm a political ecologist because I'm very much interested in how power influences the decisions we make in terms of solutions to the climate and biodiversity crisis. I'll be talking briefly about question of power again, because an important step really to finding solutions that are truly equitable and collaborative to the global biodiversity and climate crisis is really about who makes decisions. And in considering that, Gavanta admonishes us to think of decision-making not as apolitical, but involving a lot of very different actors with very different interests who operate at very different levels and use different forms of power to try to have their interests recognized or centered. Take the just ended COP, for example. Many of us might have interest and in various ways through our work contribute to the processes, but this occurs at the global level. So there's really very little, it's not open to everyone. So there's very little opportunity or space for everyone to contribute, although decisions from such high-level processes eventually must land somewhere and affect people. Speaking about people, which some of those global level decisions affect, I'm very happy to introduce you to Auntie Ama, who I met very recently during my field work in Ghana. Auntie Ama has, like many people in her the environment where she works. She's never heard about the Paris Agreement or the Global Biodiversity Framework. But every day she's overwhelmed with calls by people to integrate more trees in her farming systems. What is quite surprising is that a lot of the people who encourage her to do that, from government to civil society to even researchers, we often base our decisions on something like this. And perhaps this is even a more higher resolution, but very often on priority global restoration maps that really do not tell us so much about the context. So what we try to do in our work within the society package of the Lever Home Center, which is to try to bring a more of a social science lens to these products that sort of prioritize areas for restoration, among others. So we encourage looking beyond the sensor to really understand how the local context and institutions and tenure and power relations really influence the land use choices, but even actually the kind of options that are available to people. And so in the end, what we have is then not just a very static map, but one that we try to bring a bit to life with all these social issues. And in the process also, because we adopting or applying social science approaches has to do with a lot of interactions with the people, but also the environment, we're able to gain a better understanding of even the production systems that Auntie Ama and many like her are embedded in, not just in terms of the outputs they produce, but also the broader value chains within which they are integrated and the demands and how finance from such value chains and powerful actors that influence the kind of decisions and practices we see on the ground. But more importantly also, this enables us to really see the constraints within which people like Auntie Ama has to work. Like most people, she has less than 2 hectares of land. It's from this land that she has to meet her food needs. It's this same land that she has to also contribute to climate action and also biodiversity protection. So what really the social sciences enable us to do, and applying these participatory strategies, is it enables us to shift the discussion, not just to ask in terms of the limits of what we can do with Auntie Ama's piece of land, but also really the things that should be prioritized, who is prioritizing that, for who is that being prioritized, but crucially, who is making that decision. Is Auntie Ama having a say in those decisions, or is it that they are sort of imposed on her by different actors? I should like to thank you on this note and look forward to discussing further.
Thank you very much, Eric. We'll hand over to our final panelist, Jamie Lorimer, before opening up to a discussion, which is going to be facilitated by Michael Winter. And then we'll move over and continue the discussion with wine and crisps and juice and various other things.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thanks all for coming this evening. So I'm a professor of environmental geography here in the School of Geography and do research on the social dimensions to a range of environmental problems, but also teach social science to a range of master students, including on the biodiversity conservation management program that we run here. And I thought what I'd do is just to try and give a sense of what social science could do for natural science in 4 registers, if you like, 4 ways in which social science engages with natural science, and do that, as Eric did, in the context of some work we're doing in the Leverhulme Centre about the politics of landscape recovery in the UK and elsewhere, and particular discussions about mess, kind of aesthetic questions about what landscapes look like and why people disagree about this process of letting landscapes have a bit more autonomy. Okay, so one register of social science here is the classic describe and explain. Social scientists are good at understanding human values, social behaviors. In this context, we could look at how NEP, the image shown there, a landscape that's sort of scrubbing up, rubs up against some of the powerful cultural archetypes that frame what we think nature is in the UK, comparing it to the pastoral, to the picturesque, and to the scenic, and provide sophisticated, elaborate descriptions of the ways in which this conflicts with powerful cultural norms. And that leads to nice journal articles, but it's often quite hard then to translate that out into the public domain. So what we then do is communicate and engage as a second register. So we've had a series of public events here in Oxford. We had a nice event on the messiness of nature with artists and poets and scientists and social scientists trying to reach out to various publics in Oxford. We've written an article there that is linked if you're interested in this, and doing sort of media work. So there's a way in which social scientists become advocates for work that is going on in the natural sciences. A third register that will be familiar to some social scientists is the register of critique. So social science is somewhat removed from the practice of science and has a sort of mandate to speak truth to power. So I guess akin to what Eric was doing, there are sophisticated frameworks in the social sciences for thinking about power, thinking about culture, thinking about values. In this context, thinking about how discussions about landscape aesthetics interface with questions about land ownership, interface with questions about who benefits from different ways of bringing nature to the market, but also thinking, for example, about this idea of what we call the aesthetic paradox, that strangely the landscapes that we hold in very high cultural value in the UK are not always landscapes of very high biodiversity value. So a way of critiquing status quo approaches to conservation. But perhaps the register that's most relevant for social scientists is the register that Eric was talking about in the previous presentation, which is about collaboration. So the ways in which social science can enable natural scientists to have conversations with affected communities who are influenced by these types of management decisions that Eric was talking about. So this is in some ways a very similar sort of method in a very different context. So here we are at Farm Ed in the Cotswolds, which is 1 million miles away in some ways from the places that you're working in Ghana, Eric, but using visualization methodologies, working here with a farmer cluster, thinking about future visions of the landscape in the Cotswolds with an artist who was live drawing these conversations to give us a sense of what it might look like. So here there was a way in which you could bring practitioners, farmers, conservationists, natural scientists and social scientists together to develop a kind of participatory framework for knowledge. Okay, so just in one small project then, we have 4 different registers, 4 different roles that social scientists can play in helping natural scientists and policymakers navigate these human-environment relations. So whether that's around describing and explaining what's going on, communicating and engaging various publics with these questions, critiquing or collaborating. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Michael Winter, would you like to summarize and start the discussion? Thank you.
I will do my best. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to summarize so much. I'm just going to introduce myself. Hadn't forgotten, Caitlin. Michael Winter. I'm a colleague of Patrick's in the geography department at Exeter. Been professor at Exeter for 25 years or so. But I've also spent a lot of time doing policy. So I was on the Natural England board for 7 years until 18 months ago, been on various committees of inquiry and all that kind of stuff. So I look at it from those 2 perspectives. So I've been on the inside of trying to work out what to do with both social scientific and scientific evidence in a policy process, which, believe me, is pretty demanding at times. And Beth was right when she talked about the attention span being limited when you're up against delivering a particular output for political people. You've got to deliver it. You've got to say something. If you're given a chunk of money as an agency in government, you have targets, you have milestones, you have to meet them. So I'm not going to summarize because I think what we've heard has been really extraordinarily useful. I'm going to challenge the panel really because they've all identified some of the problems. I would say all of them have come up with creative solutions for how to do social science in those spaces, in those problematic spaces. And it undoubtedly, I can say this with no fear of contradiction, they will all come up with wonderful journal articles. Jamie alluded to that. There will be good stuff coming out of the Leverhulme work. There'll be good stuff coming out of Access. Beth, I know, does all her good stuff at Forest Research. There'll be good publications. But my challenge is this, and it's firstly, which is the greater of the 2 challenges that have come over to me? The integration. So the first one, which is the greater of these 2? The first one being integration of social science. So Jamie talked about registers, which I thought was a really helpful way of looking at it. Beth talked about disciplines. That's a challenge. Now, That's the one challenge we've heard about, how to integrate those in a way that gets over to policy. But the second challenge is, what do you do in the policy space? Because I thought Beth was really, really spot on when she basically said it's not just one particular space. It's right across from policy design to policy delivery. But even the policy design is not just done by a group of people called policymakers. There's all sorts of people involved, including internal government specialists in different sciences, including social science. So if you're a social scientist trying to influence that, you're trying to influence maybe some social scientists in the policy design space, or maybe some generalists. So which is the greater challenge? Integrating the social sciences or engaging with that breadth of the policy process? And if you can answer that, that'd be great. But could you go on to another one, whose role actually is it to do the integration? And whose role is it to the engagement? Is it something we just have to take on as social scientists to try and do the lot? Does that make sense, panel? Do you need time to think? Who's going to go first? Go on, Beth.
So by integration, you mean integration across disciplines, rather
Yeah, I
than...
mean,
Okay.
you use the word integration because you've got to somehow bring these diverse disciplines together and not scare the policy people by saying, well, actually, anthropologists say something really different to psychologists, because that doesn't help anybody.
So
But we need to avoid some kind of sort of sense that it's just a synergy, that we just get down to some lowest common denominator. So how do you do that?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, social sciences in government embody that multi-social scientific discipline. I mean, I work across a large number of those disciplines. So I suppose it already happens in government because it has to, because there's not normally that many of us social scientists, so we have to do all the jobs. But what academia can help us do is, because we are probably not going to be able to keep our disciplinary specialisms up, we're not going to know what the current research is on each subject area. That's when we come to you, and that's when if you've spent some time understanding the policy and practice landscape, you can help us to understand what is current. And you might need to do it pretty quickly, because I might need to tell someone tomorrow. So I think that's based largely, to be honest with you, on personal relationships and developing an understanding of how each other works. And I think you can do that various ways, but I don't think you asked that question, Michael, so I'll pass that to Patrick.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question you pose, the challenges you pose are really good. I think all I would say in Access is that one of the things we need, and we need lots of different things, is, I mean, you can have various different kinds of metaphors, but it's almost like some kind of connecting tissue between these different communities. And you can dress that up as co-production or whatever you want, co-production of knowledge. But what Access tries to do is to enable flows of knowledge and expertise in both directions, from academic social science into policy and back again. So that's at least one thing that we need to do that is not really stereotypically happening, or it doesn't necessarily happen. And we heard about the structural impediments to gaining access to research expertise through subscription paywalls. But I think we also need social scientists to kind of step up and, do policy relevant research and become skilled up in communicating it and engaging it, as using the register that Jamie mentioned. But we don't always necessarily teach those skills, because they don't necessarily come down to the stereotype of what an academic researcher needs to be able to do. And not all academics need to be able to do that, but some of them certainly need to. And if you're interested in environmental problems in a context of emergency, we absolutely need to prioritize those sets of skills, because, as you said, we don't necessarily need more journal papers. We need change in the world, and that change needs to be evidence-based, but we need to get that evidence base across.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the way I see it is, the question of integration is really one of communication. Clear, open, transparent communication based on mutual respect. Because in a lot of ways, many of the issues we study, cut across disciplines, and social scientists can't do it all. How we do that within the Level Home Center really is try to foster very open communication, for example, with our teams in ecology, scale, among others, and how that translates to practice, because I like to think myself as a scholar practitioner, very pragmatic. How that translates into practice really is we do field work together. So we have our ecologists, Jesus, Felipe, and co. You know, we have the social scientists going well ahead of them, you know, going to do community entry, really prepare the ground. They come, they acquire the images. It doesn't end there. We go back with the images after processing. We engage the communities. So in that process, it's in and of itself, I think, a very crucial step in terms of dissemination takes place. Not all of it, because the maps will still need to be, you know, whatever method you are using, and the mapping and the rest will still need to be processed. But just the process of in the process of the co-creation itself, I think some actors, whether community at the community level or policymakers, to the extent you engage them, already, you know, get a fair idea. So I don't really see it as a sort of a binary situation where you have a start and then you're done and have to find a way to integrate that, but rather a continuous process where you really co-design and co-own what is produced.
So just briefly to pick up on your first challenge, Michael, about how to embed social science into policymaking, and it's great to hear what Patrick was talking about. And another metaphor might be to think about a pipeline of skills, trained graduates that could imagine careers into policymaking with an environmental social science background. And I've seen that change a lot in the 10 years that I've been here and involved in our master's programs and PhD programs, where there's a much greater appetite for policy internships, for having relationships with alumni that would come back and speak in our programs, and in a way that other disciplines, business or health, have been better at creating MBAs or sort of masters in public policy, to think about that in a kind of environmental context. So there's a group of very skilled graduates who can take up those roles would be really crucial.
Thank you very much, panel. Right, we've got sort of quarter of an hour, 20 minutes to throw it open for questions now. There's a roving mic here. Yeah, one here. Can I just suggest you keep questions as short as you can, and just say briefly who you are?
This is just for the online audience. So
Okay, hi, my name's Matilda and I work at Oxford Net Zero in the engagement team. One of the challenges we have as a research group is that we have physical scientists and social scientists, and our priorities on what we want to communicate is often quite different, but people see Oxford Net Zero as one coherent voice. Do you have any tips amongst the panel or yourself about how to kind of navigate these different arguments and flows and debates that go on within our research group to present a united front?
That's a brilliant question. Who wants to go first? Well, anybody putting a hand up? Patrick?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is really intriguing. It's a tension. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but, you know, access is there to advance social science, but it isn't one thing, and science isn't one thing. The understanding of science is really poor. It's not a thing that's static. It's always changing. Scientists should be uncertain or questing for new ideas all the time, but we kind of popularly think of it as a thing rather than as a kind of a process of inquiry. And I think we have to understand your slide. The social sciences are plural, and they don't always sit easily with each other either. And okay, we might need at certain times to be pragmatic in getting a simple, concise message across to a certain stakeholder. But we also need to do justice to the multiplicity of ideas and conflicts within our own areas of expertise. And I don't think it really does us an awful lot of favors to brush that under the carpet and pretend as if it isn't existing, because that's not being an expert either. So I think at least some of the time we have to talk about plurality, multiplicities of knowledge, and try and make the best of that, because that's a messy process, but it is where we actually are. And rather than trying to present Oxford Net Zero as any one thing, because I just don't think it can be. Or you get into debates about a socio-technical perspective, and what does that really mean? And it's the T is bigger than the S most of the time, and all that. Anyway, we can come back to that.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing I'd add to that is, I mean, there's research has been done showing, certainly by Brian Wynne a few years ago, about how the public you can accept uncertainty. if it's explained in certain ways. So you don't, you've obviously got to go so far in order to present a united position, but you don't have to rule out every single area of uncertainty. There's a question here.
Could you press that,
Hello, hi, I'm Mina, a senior lecturer in architecture just up the road and a local architect. The built environment hasn't been mentioned in this conversation, but how do you feel the built environment sort of, I guess, have you looked at built environment in this human nature relationship in your work here?
Okay, who's certainly academics have. Jamie, you done something?
Yeah, so certainly in the Leverhulme Centre, we have an interest in cities and cities as places where most of people obviously live, and places where you can, have a great deal of access to folk and get them connected into different, green spaces, but also a place where you get much greater social difference and heterogeneity, and so in some ways many more challenges for thinking in our work around different perceptions of nature and how they work. But I think there has been a pivot in work on nature recovery to think about the urban as a really important place for health reasons and for social justice reasons. So yes.
I mean, certainly in my time on Natural England Board, it was becoming an increasingly important issue. And we had some, you'd expect all our site visits to be to lovely places in the country, but we actually had some urban-based ones, which are really, really interesting.
Just briefly say something.
Yeah, sure.
Have you heard about environmental psychology? Because it kind of originated as an architecture-facing subdiscipline of the discipline of psychology. So there should be some interesting things there around, how to design, how to input that into the process. But
Okay, thanks.
maybe talk to you more about that afterwards.
Yeah, very briefly, just to say, forest research has an urban team, and actually that's often where social science, natural science comes together most effectively. And the urban also isn't, so if urban environmental social science isn't just about access to nature. I'm very I've worked a lot in access to nature, but I think a lot of the other key social science questions get missed. And it's a key policy area. We've got huge house building ambitions now. So we need to be looking at what does that mean for nature, and what does that mean for how the sciences work together to help achieve that at the same time as a sustainable environment for us to live in. So really key.
Okay, looking for more questions. Yep.
Hi, I'm Mia. I'm a behavioral ecologist and conservation biologist, also up down the road with where Mina is. And so my question is that I'm kind of thinking about, we need not reinvent the wheel, that there's a lot of structures that are available that might perhaps be underutilized. So for example, in the natural scientists, there's a lot of focus on like endpoint things, especially with REF, like the publications. You mentioned publications yourself many times, but I wonder what the role can be in actually bringing people into the process of science, and what that means for us actually developing not our sciences and our projects, not just to think about the end goal, but actually bringing in the social scientists to understand how integrating people into this process can also itself be something that helps contribute towards the human nature relationship.
Thank you. So citizen science, perhaps action
Not
research?
just citizen
Not
science.
citizen science.
No, not
Why
just
not
that.
citizen science then?
Not just.
Oh, not just. Okay. Yeah. That's why I went on to say action research, but there's presumably other descriptions as well. Yeah. Okay. Who? Yeah.
I think a very important thing to consider in thinking through this is really also the broader institutional structures that, finance, especially a lot of the research work that we do, and also just even the nature of contracts more broadly. I think one fact about social science, a lot of social science approaches, is they really require time. You really need a lot of time to be able to do very meaningful work, especially in a way that involves people in the co-production process. Just to share a very little example with you. So in the current projects we are doing, one of the key things we focus on was co-designing our surveys with our partners on the ground. And the idea here was that in the end, whatever came out could then be used by them in subsequent years to monitor different elements of multidimensional poverty, but also just changes over time. You know, as a postdoc on a contract, my tendency is, guys, this is taking too long. Let's finish it yesterday. Let me collect my data and write my papers, you know. So I think we need a bit of a rethinking of, you know, the broader underpinnings and structures that underlie financing of research in considering this question. Thank you.
Yeah. Who else? Anyone else?
We've got some online questions.
Oh, have you?
Which I'll read one out. There's quite a provocative one.
Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. This is from Douglas McNabb online. Demonstrating the value of social science to policymakers is arguably critical. Case studies could be powerful here. Can the panel point to examples of where social science input has tangibly contributed to better policy and outcomes?
So many, I don't know what
It is difficult because I think part of what social science does, and recognizing the roles that Jamie's put up, but also I think there are other roles, including innovation and reframing what the problem is. It can be quite difficult. So I work for quite a long time on the new environmental land management scheme policy area as a social scientist, and I think tracing impact can be really tricky, because ultimately what a lot of the time I'm trying to do is build a base level of understanding about the importance of considering social science research, but also insights, approaches, ways of thinking. And so you can't always, I mean, there are examples, and, you know, I think there was some great stuff through that have improved agri-environment schemes, for example. There's great examples of improvement. There's a lot of work on sort of access to environment, how it links into health. I think there's all sorts of examples. But I think also wanting that sort of linear route between the social research, it gets implemented, here's the impact. That's a really naive way of thinking about how policy and practice absorb and use evidence. And I think looking at, so for now, a lot of the nature agencies now explicitly include people in their mission statements. That wasn't the case, a decade ago. So I think you've got to look at it in the broad sense. And my colleague David Edwards at Forest Research has produced a paper on evidencing impact that's a lot broader than what we could traditionally consider impact. And it could be things like you've actually encouraged a colleague to start commissioning some social science research. Do you know what I mean? And it's really hard to trace it. And I have had this discussion with Patrick about the case studies that we can use to evidence. And they are out there, but I think we need to think broader than just, we talk to some people, we put this data in, and then we got a great outcome. And also, what's the counterfactual to that? Like, people disenfranchised? Do you go out and measure that? Do you know what I mean? It's not that simple.
Yeah, broadly, I'd agree with that. Douglas, was it? Yeah, Douglas. So I think all of Beth's caveats are really important here, that we need to move away from a very linear model of we're the experts. We send nuggets of expertise into the government machinery, which is a black box, and then it has impact. That almost never happens. And it's not necessarily because social science is deficient in any way. As I said, there are all these structural barriers, so that there might be tons of relevant social science findings, but policymakers never find out about them because they're not reading the journal of what's it or whatever, or they don't ever find out. But it is a good question, and we should be able to answer it, even just finding one example. And in Access, in our first work package, we did try and find some examples, and there are at least 3 listed on our website of concrete. And one, which I think is quite a nice example to choose, is the Climate Change Committee. Where did that come from? Why did it become instituted? Who recommended it? It's not always been there. It was an institutional innovation. And I think one of the points I want to make here is that, what do we think about when we think about policy relevant social science? In the last 5 or 10 years, it's been increasingly positioned as behavioral science or some kind of knowledge about behavior change. But the social sciences are also extremely good at understanding institutional changes, structural changes, but they're not always recognized as being really useful for that. And I think the Climate Change Committee, which is one direct example of impact from one social science project that you can find out more about on the Access website, is a good example of informing structural change and political change and institutional change, which social scientists are also very, very good at understanding. So there we are, there's one at least.
Sorry. Just so I don't lose my job, can I give one from forestry research as well? Plug. Yeah, so lots of councils, I didn't work on this project, I hasten to add, my colleague Bianca Ambrosio did. Lots of local authorities didn't have a trees and woodland strategy, can you believe, in this day and age? And if they did, it was all around managing risks. It wasn't around how trees and woodlands should contribute to the biodiversity climate emergency for, you know, what their benefits to local communities. So social science identified that was an issue. Social science then worked with local authorities and Tree Council and others to develop a really usable, actionable tree and woodland strategy toolkit, which you can all access via the Tree Council and Forest Research websites. And now, I can't remember the figures, but quite a large percentage of those local authorities now have a woodland strategy toolkit. They're drawing down funds to fund what they want to do around trees and woodlands. So yeah, that's a really concrete example for you.
I would just add briefly to that it's very serendipitous what ends up being useful to policy. One of the reasons I got involved in policy was with the sort of view that it would be nice to bring some of my research to bear on some of these issues. And so for 25 years or so, I've kind of engaged in that way at a sort of board level or committee level. And it is serendipitous. You know, things I think are really important social science findings that should change things just don't catch the eye or the ear of the right person with the right policy challenge at the right time. Other things you think, oh, suddenly realize that you can throw something in. So it's been in the right place at the right time, I think, often to try and get that influence. And it doesn't necessarily mean at that kind of board level, it can be at all sorts of level. The operational level can be crucial. You know, local authorities currently developing local nature recovery strategies. Tremendous opportunity, I think, for local nature conservation organisations to be in there influencing and involved in that with social science coming to bear as well, because some of those organisations have got quite alive to the social science issues that lie behind them. They've had to, because they have. Anyway, I'm going to end up saying too much. As
We'll take one more question from online before going back.
There's one at the back here. Okay, one online first, and then we'll come to you in a minute.
Let's do it in person first, Stephen, and then I'll pack two online into one.
Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Jane Hull. I actually work for the Forestry Commission, so I'm a kind of practitioner who's done a bit of policy and a bit of delivery, and Beth has seen right into my soul. And I really want to pick up the question about timing. When I've been working both in delivery and policy, the things that really help are for social scientists and indeed any other scientists to be really clear about the level of rigor with which you are coming up with a statement. So I used to work back on the government forestry and woodlands policy statement about a decade ago. And what was really helpful was evidence papers that said statement and then what level of confidence do we have in this? You know, one side of A4, really quick. We do read journals occasionally, but mainly just the abstracts. And that point you picked up about timing as well, you know, how to be able to, maybe if you're part of a longer, you know, more rigorous project, yet to be able to go quickly, we can tell you this with this level of confidence at this stage. If you want to know this, it might take another 5 years, but actually through, I don't know, Delphi approaches or something, we could work a bit more quickly on that. So this is just some sort of top tips from living in the front line. Thanks.
That's really helpful. I don't know, do any of the panel want to respond? I mean, it was more adding to what we've said. So I think perhaps thank you. We'll leave it at that and go to a question.
We've there's a lady. We'll go do an online. So we've got quite a lot online, and then we'll go back to the audience. But I'm just maybe going to wrap 3 questions into one. This is all around. So somebody, Konika, says they would love to hear what you think the role that tacit knowledge plays in addressing environmental and biodiversity challenges. An anonymous attendee asks about the dualistic human nature role and how we can actually promote the relevance of social science in contrast to natural science without rectifying society as something else as nature. And I think those two things, maybe tacit knowledge and human nature connections, are quite integrated. And a final one, because my question is, does social science actually have to have policy impact? Is this something that we need to be drilling into social scientists? Are there other kinds of impact that social sciences can have? There was a question to the end around this linear association between evidence production leading to policy creation, leading to top-down delivery. Can we think about other kinds of place-based, more varied interactions that are locally contextualized? So that's quite a few questions packed into one, but we have loads of questions online, so I hope that's okay.
Right, yeah, there's a lot there. Who wants to go? Who wants to have a go at any of them?
Try the last one.
Go on, Jamie.
Yeah, I guess we can think about impacts that we have out with the policy process in terms of media work, in terms of writing, in terms of activism, that all in some ways shape the conversation in society that then policymakers had to listen to. So there are kind of indirect ways, I suppose, in which we shape the kind of zeitgeist or the sort of feeling around these things, which might be worth thinking about.
Okay. Anyone on the tacit knowledge issue?
Yeah, I think that's a very important and interesting question. One of my supervisors, often talk about this unrecognized contribution of local people to nature recovery. So through, exactly what they are currently doing. And I quite like this idea she keeps, bringing up. It's about the reverse gaze. So, instead of really just looking at things from a very, highly scholarly perspective, so I just also sometimes have the humility to really, be willing to learn, from different actors who are, already doing different things. I always like to give very clear examples, like Auntie Amma, who I illustrated in the case. In many ways, she's found very interesting ways of even growing what we call cocoa asibari. So it's the scoria species, a species of yam that does not, it's a sciophyte. It doesn't really like sun. It grows under shade. Next to this, she's found so many creative ways of integrating very specific trees, at very different configurations that works for her. But the science, because the focus really is on adding more, quantifying more, and earning more might not necessarily, agree with it. So it's really about having the humility to sometimes also admit when we are wrong as scientists to really learn from other actors.
Thanks, Eric. Anyone on the human
I can add a bit.
nature? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I wasn't going to try and answer the tacit one, but I think go back to my role as a farm conservation advisor, and I worked a lot in social sciences with farming communities as well. And I think part of our role as social scientists is to help codify tacit knowledge, isn't it, and help it work within other. If we're talking about power imbalances, often that tacit knowledge is pretty powerless. And so our role as a social scientist is to help codify it, make it work alongside other dominant forms of knowledge. And certainly as a farm conservation advisor, I thought that was part of my role, to understand and listen to the farmers I work with, and then find some way of feeding that back into the organisation that I worked for. I'm not sure how successful I was at that, but I felt that was part of my role. And then just in terms of the other impact, I worked for a while as community development project manager. So I'd worked with communities and community garden projects and restoration projects and all kind of that. And I was desperate for access to ways, sort of rigorous ways for me to consult with and engage with and research with my community. And that was before I'd done any social science. And I think that's, it's not all about policy. I just think that's quite urgent. But yeah, of course, there's other ways we can have impact. We should be working with community groups to empower them. As Connie mentioned in her opening introduction, we need to be understanding what's going on at that level and working with those groups to empower them to be in the part of the conversation. So yeah, we've got lots of things to do.
Any more questions? I think there was one. Yeah, here. And then, okay.
Hi, my name is Lessa. I'm a DPhil student in the ICCS. Great insights, but I like what you talked about co-production, and then I was thinking, for us to be able to do that or to integrate, you need time to be able to develop relationships. And we have, if we are integrating relationship, we also think about power that has already been talked about as well. And I was thinking most of academics, they work around timeline of project. What incentives are there for actually integrating social sciences into environmental problems? Thank you.
So that's a really good question. I'm not going to even try to answer it because I think it's so difficult, but who wants? Could someone have a go?
I think perhaps one key incentive really is also just the possibility of developing something that works to context. I think that should be quite incentivizing enough to be willing to make a bit of sacrifices in relation to time. How we've approached that, again, I'm a man of examples. How we've approached that within the Leverhulme Center, for example, is we've spent basically the first year of our engagement on the project that I showed with the mapping and all that, just the first year trying to just understand the context, and really living in the community for months on end to really build relationships. I understand this might not be accommodated within the framework of every research, but perhaps it's also happening because we have allowed it to happen. I think we scholars in many ways also should be able to influence the institutions that shape the grants and funding mechanisms that we receive, whether it's different forms of protests or letters to journals, which we are very good at writing. So and things like that. But I think we need to slowly begin to challenge this orthodoxy, and perhaps then there might be some hope that we don't have to always rush through the project anticipating the next.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that in my experience in the discipline of geography, at least, people are very mindful of their positionality and their keenness, I guess, to avoid very extractive research relationships with communities or residents or households, whatever the research is about. So in my experience, geographers at least are very attuned to that, maybe more attuned than perhaps many people are in engineering and physical science or in natural science, though I wouldn't be quite so sure of that in terms of evidence. So, and I do think there is an appreciation that case studies or qualitative methods are important because they don't set they allow people to have a voice in a research process, which I think questionnaire surveys don't necessarily, or other kinds of methods don't necessarily enable that. But as we've been kind of discussing really since the start, it isn't necessarily the case that case studies or qualitative data are seen or perceived as being as robust or as significant by people in policy or people in other domains. So I think there's still a challenge there. And I referred to my experience in the IPCC when I spoke earlier, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In this chapter, we brought in case studies, little vignettes of particular places in the world where interventions had happened. But there was resistance to that. And some people around the table did not feel that it was showing off the science in social science. So I think there's still quite a lot to be done in terms of talking about what rigor and robustness means in a context of co-production and getting away from extractive research relationships and enabling tacit knowledge to come forward. Because I don't think that's always appreciated as much as it needs to be.
Thanks, Patrick. There's a quick question here. So go on. Well, look, the microphone can come around the side. And then quickly there. And then
Well, just to say, let's be honest, I mean, I don't think the academia does incentivize that, does it? So, so I think, although I think there are more and more opportunities, so I think it does have to be part of a passion project because it might make your career trajectory a bit more complicated. It's not always easy to get into disciplinary research published. It'll take a bit longer because you'll have to come to an agreement between all the disciplines about how you're going to work together. But there's a lot that you get out of it. And if you start developing those relationships, like Eric said, and you start building in from the beginning, we're going to need a bit more time. I don't think you'll regret it. I just think academia needs to recognise that needs to be prioritised.
thanks. Right, our final question then.
Hello, Evelyn Sanderson. First of all, I'm really delighted to be here and that the Leverhulme Centre has opened its doors to the community. So I wear two hats. I'm both an activist trying to save a meadow in Italy. I've also founded an organisation called the Oxfordshire Donut Economics Collective for the purpose of working cross-topic, cross-sector in a way that uses systems thinking and regenerative and redistributive processes. And I'm going to lay down the gauntlet and set you a challenge. In Glasgow, they've got a project called Glasgow as a Living Lab for Accelerating Novel Transformation. And they have used donut economics both to look at the issues that are present and to try and start using common purpose and common language to come together to co-create something really different. I know that Oxford University has got a local policy lab with Brooks and with the council. And I would love to see more research generated, co-created, with time for relationships to build and feedback loops to occur.
Okay, so well, I don't have to say anything about that because I'm not from Oxford. So
Yeah, I mean, there is a branch of our work which is very much working here in Oxford with local communities. I don't know, is Kay here? Who could speak to that? But yeah, been working with the local nature recovery partnerships, working particularly in thinking about kind of health questions in Oxford, and it would be great to follow up after this and to introduce you to some of those people.
okay, I think that yeah, you have a chat. Oh, go. Oh, are we allowed one more? Go on then. This is really the last one. Previous.
Well, it's not a question, so at least don't drag on. I just want to say, I think times are changing, and I think like I'm a social interdisciplinary scientist, and I work with loads of people that I see here, like from the natural sciences and the social sciences. I think times are changing a little bit, and I think I really enjoyed this, and I appreciate so much the work that all of you are doing. But in a little bit of a way, I feel like this discussion is a little bit dated. I think like what we like what Eric showed, where it was not just social science, it was a mix of what he's like doing with the natural scientists, and we're working together actually really well now in many ways. And I think one of the things that we need to try to push away from a little bit, even though it's kind of hard, is this kind of defensiveness about natural and social sciences. And like somebody asked earlier on, who's responsible? We're all responsible, I think, if we want to do good science and we want to work together and we want to make both at the grassroots level up to the high level of the the conferences and the United Nations. So I think like we have amazing scientists. I think this list is quite limited for social sciences. And I think especially in terms of interdisciplinarity, it depends on our how we work together. And I think we have like lots of potential. And yeah, thank you all for your contributions today. It was really enjoyable.
Thank you, Aoife. And I think maybe that's some food for thought for the discussions in the networking reception. And also there's a really brilliant question online that's all about conflict. And it's how do we ensure that social science doesn't create more conflict and division? I'm quite pro-conflict. I think we need to embrace it. But maybe that links with some of Aoife's points there. And I also just wanted to mention there was a question about how to integrate social science with regards to timeframes with projects. We have Mark, if you can wave, Mark. Talk to Mark about this and the Agile Initiative. But thank you so much to our panelists. Maybe we do a final round of applause, and Connie in the Leading Centre. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. There's going to be drinks in the atmosphere room. If we can maybe just let the panel exit first before you grab them with questions, just so the doorway's free. But they'll be there to talk and have a glass of wine and continue the conversation in the atmosphere room. And thank you online for your wonderful questions. All right. Thank you, everyone.